So I've been keeping up with the UK lately and kind of looking at people like Sargon of Akkad, a YouTuber. Name is Carl Benjamin, who supports a guy named Rupert Lowe, who just created the Restore Britain Party. And that party gained about 10% popularity in the first day. And a lot of people don't even know it exists yet. So we'll see how that goes. But the point is, that party is about basically taking back control from all of the minorities that have come there and are committing violence, and they're protesting against the existing government, and the government's taking up for them, and they are upholding the rights of these minority groups, and then they are curbing the rights of British people, and they're pretty much tired of that situation. So you can look him up. His name is Rupert Lowe. The party is Restore Britain. But I wanted to talk about that because there's a key question here that seems to be hiding in the background for centuries, maybe, because we've never actually been faced with it. But a number of European countries are, and people are really beginning to ask, like, what happens when your country pretty much changes hands from the identity of its primary lineage and culture over to something else? And as it turns out, opposition to that shift right now is comprising one of the fastest growing movements in the world. So it's kind of like a group of ethnocentrists. I mean, maybe you could call them ethnocentrist or ethnocultural. They're trying to build a moral movement out of this. And that does, in fact, issue a direct challenge to the framing of the West because uh, we have a lot of, say, excessive liberal surface paint that is over our doctrine, and it's been applied to our nations over the centuries. And we're testing the limits of that in this situation. So if you really sit and think about each of the scenarios in turn, like how you would respond if the United States became something other than what it was. Say it became like a Central American nation or a Muslim nation, or it adopted East Asian culture. Would that render the U.S. non existent? And does that supplant some kind of cultural right? Like, do you have a collective right as a majority American cultural member to hold on to the land and chart its destiny? Because, like, should you oppose displacement, in other words? And those questions are becoming very, very consequential. So I'm going to play the devil's advocate, and I'm going to try to show, like, what that would look like under moral framing. Let's say you're a white American and you want to oppose ethnic or cultural displacement. How would you frame that? And I think it might look something like this. First off, you have to consider yourself to have collective rights. You need to be a group. All right, and if you, that's very easy to do under American liberal framing because they assign all kinds of collective rights to all kinds of groups. And so you could simply borrow their framework and apply it to you, and then boom, you got all the rights that you need to pursue that, right? You have the legitimacy if you just use their rules. So, um, but basically, you need to be able to be seen as a people unto yourself. And that would be like a group of Enlightenment based European descendants who are liberal minded. And what I mean by liberal in this context is global liberal. Like the West is liberal. It's not the same as American liberal. The West is a liberal frame. So, but basically, you might have a natural drive to defend and possess what you created or your ancestors created, whatever. So, I'm not saying that we necessarily have a right to that because under the framework, you have to put equality in the background a little bit. Because if you're just another group fighting for control, survival, and self determination, then you're in the midst of a power game. And it's less that you have a right to control the framework you created under equality, but more that heritage is the alternative framework there, that it carries a drive for self-ownership. And if you have a right to exist as a group, then that right applies to exist where you are and with your current holdings, such that it's wrong to displace you. And it could be construed as a right to entrench or compete in terms of power. So, and that would apply whether you're in control or you're fighting for control, right? So, and before you dismiss that, as it would apply to, say, white people, or at least cultural white Americans and all its adoptees, look at the way that minority groups have historically operated. And that's very simple. They've operated as groups under the American liberal framing. So you don't need the specifics there to understand that identity formation has worked for minority groups, and those groups have no qualms about wielding those advantages. And we always consider that a moral undertaking because of the civil rights issues. And we just automatically tie any objective that a minority group has to a civil rights issue. Now, you could argue very easily that some of the objectives that some minority groups have blow the scope of civil rights. And if you're looking at a lot of rollbacks that have happened this year, those are the areas in which those arguments and issues, conversations can take place. But I just don't see that there's necessarily a moral asymmetry between a minority group pressing advantages based on its ethnicity or culture, but it's immoral for British people or French people to form ethno movements to try to retain control of their countries. Like, it's just not obvious that there's a difference there. So maybe the ethnic banner is the wrong framing. I mean, maybe you could apply it just culturally, but I am considering, like, in the ethno framing, all of the adoptees as well. And there are often a lot of those. So I think it's important to note that there seems to be like a practical and situational limit to equality, and that appears to be activated when the loss of control becomes a subjective threat. So, in other words, you might exist happily as a minority, believing you have equality, but you start threatening the cultural structure and you start trying to seize control, then that illusion is dropped. And that's really what I think we're seeing in Europe right now. So you see like the pretense of that eroding. And it could be such that if you continued down this path, it would trigger some kind of dead hand switch that pushed everyone over into force doctrine, right? Because, like, you can see a lot of the inputs that are similar to what came before World War II in terms of that happening. So you displace more and more, you threaten more and more, people grow more and more concerned, and then they retaliate. So that's pretty simple. What you can conclude from this, I think, is that you're not going to achieve a transition of power. Let's say if you're a minority group and the objective is to transition power away from the majority culture, that path is not linear. I mean, because you could have all kinds of opposition arise as you approach that objective. And matter of fact, the path itself might be an illusion. The only way you might be able to achieve that is through force. And I don't think that's a very good objective to hold if that's what it has to come to. It's infinitely better to try to get along with people. But because if you look to the past, it's been colonization and war that have caused countries to change hands culturally. So, and another conclusion is that if you pursue those kinds of objectives, you're going to end up with majority opposition. And if you're being opposed by a majority, that almost always leads to oppressive states. So that's not good either. And then also, there doesn't seem to be a moral asymmetry when you're talking about a majority trying to hold power and a minority trying to take it. And the only reason that we even try to view the majority as immoral when it defends its power is because of historical abuses. But you can't derive an automatic conclusion for that, because you're missing a premise that it's never justified for the majority to defend its power, and that's wrong, because the conclusion doesn't follow from those premises. So I don't know. It just seems to me that this is all very interesting, and if you if you have to frame this under collective rights, then you have to frame it under collective rights in terms of the majority also.